Well, hello and welcome to the first Channel 4 News Google Hangout. Now, this is organised in association with the LSE's Media Policy Project, and we're here to discuss the fallout from the Leveson report and the government's response and where we all think this may or may not be going. There's lots of people with us on this Hangout, and I will introduce them in a moment. Those of you who are following this on Google Plus can obviously work that out for yourselves by holding your cursor over their images. But I will bring them in a moment. We've got representatives from all sides, and here with me in the Channel 4 News studio, if I just kind of step back a little bit, is Charlie Beckett, who is from the LSE and who used to work here actually as a program editor. But is now in the world of academia and an author in his own right. And let's just talk, Charlie, first of all, about what happened. For those who haven't read the newspapers and been across absolutely everything, so we've got independent self-regulation backed up by statute with a backstop regulator with Ofcom,
and
which may or may not all be contradictory.
It may or may not be contradictory. You know, Leveson said it is essential that there is a statutory force to his proposals for this regulator. At the same time, he says it is absolutely not state regulation. And now, in a sense, this has become, in a way, academic, because immediately the Prime Minister said, whilst he welcomed all that stuff about regulation and independence, he is opposed in principle to the statutory element. And then you get his coalition partner Nick Clegg saying he's all in favour of the statutory element plus the rest of it, and of course Ed Miliband likewise, all in favour of that. So
and also some Tories as well. There's the George Eustace bunch of Conservative MPs who are also in favour of statutory regulation in some form.
In fact, the only people who are really clear on this are the newspapers this morning.
And David Cameron.
And David Cameron has been very clear on it as well. And I think it was built into the actual Leveson proposals. You know, it was, some call it elegant, other people call it confused. You know, this is quite a sophisticated attempt for him to give carrots as well as sticks. So there are actually some statutory elements that the press might like. So, you know, The Guardian this morning says, yes, we like the bit where it says you have a statutory right to claim public interest, and if you join in with this independent regulator, you'll be protected from huge fines if you make mistakes.
All right, well, let's bring in our guests on this Hangout, and I'll introduce them all to you. Damien Tambini is also from the LSE and broadly backs reform. Martin Moore is from the Media Standards Trust and founded Hacked Off, and his response, as you can imagine, is pretty hacked off with David Cameron, I would imagine. We'll get to him in a moment. Lara Fielden is a former journalist and formerly of Ofcom, who believes that Britain can maybe learn from regulatory frameworks abroad. Neil Wallace, ex-News of the World. You'll be familiar with Neil from the coverage, and is pretty against most of the propositions, I think, in the report, but we'll get to him in a moment. Hugh Tomlinson QC represented Sienna Miller, one of the aggrieved celebrities in this whole case, and we also hope to have Mary Ellen Field, who is a phone hacking victim herself. Neil, let's come to you first. Is it all bad?
No, it isn't all bad. There's some. There's obviously a lot of work gone into the Leveson report, but there's a lot of problems with it as well. And to be very quick and give you headlines, most of what's in Leveson would be acceptable into the Hunt proposals, which are the press ideas of self-regulation. What it doesn't do is address at all the proportionality of, there has been some unconscionable things happen, some dreadful things happen, whether it's to the Dowler family, to the victims of so on and so forth, but that has to be looked at in the context of 5 million stories a year, 1,200 newspapers, 30,000 journalists, and a tiny handful have on occasion got it wrong.
So do you think that handful are the price of a free press?
Essentially, I fear it is, yes. And what I don't think we should ignore in this, though, is that there is simply no way, as you said it when you were tweeting yesterday, and you implied earlier, that it is an oxymoron to use the word state and to suggest that that regulation can be free. They are married to each other, and what it means is, as he actually spells out, buried in his report, the phrase that interference with the activities in the media shall be lawful if it is for a legitimate purpose. Who is going to decide that? However, just to move on slightly, however, from today, I think what is going to happen, though, Christian, is more devil is going to emerge in the detail, which is that scattered around this report, there are many, many other restrictions on investigative journalism. There is a severe danger to the confidentiality of sources, for instance. There is the suggestion of imprisoning journalists. There are extensions on the idea of having to particularly reveal who you're talking to the police. And I think that sort of detail will come out more. And what's clear is the people who will suffer most isn't actually the stories in red top newspapers; it's investigative journalism.
All right. Let me bring in Martin Moore, who's obviously on the other side of this. Martin, I mean, how do you reconcile this? The idea that you can have an independent self-regulation backed up by the law.
Well,
isn't it
one
all
of the things? No, I mean, I think one of the things that people have missed throughout this, and I think there is a real danger here of massively oversimplifying Leveson's recommendations. As Charlie said, he's been extremely careful and trodden a very, very fine line. And what he has said, he has not said that there should be any statutory regulator. He has said there should be a regulator of the regulator. So in other words, it's a two-tier system. He has said he does not want any involvement. The point is, he wants to have some way. So he has absolutely categorically said that the PCC. I mean, I would recommend reading a bit about the PCC. It is scathing about the PCC. That was the organisation that was held up for 20 years for being an effective regulator. He is absolutely scathing. He then looks at the plan put forward by the press for a new system, and he says it doesn't come close to his idea of independence. And so he's dismissed the two incredibly important aspects the press have come up with. So therefore, think about that and think about where we go from there. If the press come up with a new plan, how on earth is anyone going to have any trust in it if there is not some sort of independent, external way of saying this is a decent plan? Otherwise, we're just going around the same block again and again and again.
Well, let me bring in Hugh Tomlinson. I mean, Hugh, can you explain why an independent regulator guaranteed by statutes would really change anything?
Listen,
I mean, if people were breaking the law, if people were breaking the rules, why do you think they suddenly would stop just because this is a statutory regulator?
Well, that's a rather loaded way of putting the question. The position is this: what the press are afraid of is effective regulation, because the press have had a system of rules since 1993 which they have consistently ignored. There are rules about accuracy, about privacy, and the idea, Neil Wallace consistently comes out with this, that it's a small minority of people. It's total nonsense. I mean,
well,
you only have to look. You only have to look. Just examine a copy of the News of the World. I mean, the News of the World consistently, on a weekly basis, broke the rules of the PCC, and it was consistently let off the hook. Now, what the press are frightened of is some regulator which actually makes them obey the rules. Now, a regulator that makes them obey the rules has to be tough and independent. What Lord Justice Leveson has said is we'll have a tough and independent regulator that the press set up themselves, and we have, as Martin said, a kind of franking system. So an independent body says whether that's good enough or not. Now, the press, what are the press frightened of? I mean, the answer is very simple. They're actually frightened of effective rules because they want to be able to break the rules as they have done for 50 years. I mean, it really is a very, very simple equation.
Lara Fielden, what can we learn from abroad?
Well, I think what we can learn is what Leveson hasn't done. So if you look at the ends of the spectrum in terms of press regulation in those countries that sort of top the charts in terms of press freedom, you've got at one extreme Germany, where there's no independent members of the press board there. It's literally peer regulation of industry by industry. Clearly not gone for that. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got Denmark, where the Press Council is actually set up in statute. He hasn't gone for that either, although there was a lot of talk about the Danish model before he published, and that might have been the preferred option for some of the victims of phone hacking. What he's gone for is something very akin to the Irish model, which recognises the criteria that a Press Council must fulfil in statute. It doesn't set up a Press Council. It operates very successfully in Ireland, and I think it's notable that those members of the British press that operate in Ireland, so you're talking about the Irish Daily Mail, the Irish Daily Mirror, they're signed up members. They don't have a problem with it. And by being a member of this voluntary press council, you then get benefits if you were to be fighting a defamation action in Ireland, because you can use your press council membership to show that you're a credible and an accountable body. So I think it's very significant that actually this is a voluntary model. Now, of course, there's huge incentives, and if you choose to sit outside it, then you will get clobbered financially in the courts further down the line. He makes that very clear. But I don't think it's right when you said in your introduction that there's a backstop power for Ofcom. He's simply suggesting that somebody has to recognise whether the press council that the press is encouraged to come up with fulfills the criteria set out in statute. In Ireland, that's done by the Irish Justice Minister. Here, he's suggesting Ofcom as something more at an arm's length. So I think you have to be very clear what the role is that Ofcom would fulfill.
But I think you have to understand what the role of Ofcom would be, and as somebody who's regulated by Ofcom, I can tell you it's a very powerful force in what you do on a daily basis. So the idea that Ofcom would basically be an invisible regulator is perhaps a little naive. The fact that they can report on what you're doing on a regular basis and say whether it's working or not. And whether
sorry,
This
is not. Sorry, this.
That's just completely.
Damien,
Can I come in on there, because I think we've made some progress, but there's a real need to inject some clarity and to actually educate on what this report actually says. And I think we can start with Neil and also with you. Ofcom is not being proposed as a regulator of the press.
Yes.
Ofcom has a very minimal, and there is no suggestion either that if the press refuse to go into this self-regulatory system, they will be regulated by Ofcom.
What do you think Ofcom
that is not the role. The role of Ofcom is to check, and Leveson suggests every 2 to 3 years, that this system is working fairly for both sides, for newspapers and also for people that complain about newspapers.
Well, exactly. So it is a backstop system.
No,
So
it's regulating the regulator, not regulating newspapers.
And so you don't think it would have any effect on newspapers?
Neil,
come back in.
Yeah, sorry. Look, what we're wonderfully naively, hopefully for all the best reasons doing here of a number of these fine people is ignoring the prospect of mission creep. So try to think of a, well, I mean, it's a very foolish thing you're saying. Really.
This is absolute, Neil, this is absolute nonsense. It is absolute nonsense, and you know it's nonsense.
And then we'll bring you in.
Well, this is part of it, really. Old Hugh sits there trying to shout down a voice he doesn't like. Well, well, here we go again. Look, Hugh,
make your point, Neil.
People like you want to shout out and over talk the voices you don't like, and the problem you have is that people, once these laws come in, you will find that there will be reviews. It is a thin end of the wedge. There will be accretion of powers, and let's add this little bit of extra regulation. And I tell you what, there is no doubt in my mind, there is a huge, and in the public as well, that there is a huge amount of this comes out as revenge out of the expenses scandal, and we're going to see the neutering of the British press. Yesterday, Carl Bernstein, that great guru of the free media in America, said on Channel 4 that this is an easy, lazy answer to a tough question.
Okay, Hugh, come back.
I mean, Neil has been, I've seen him on the television endlessly spouting the same complete nonsense. I mean, the idea that there is mission creep and that there are people plotting to suppress the press and the freedom of the press is under threat is just complete and utter nonsense. There is nothing in it whatever. I mean, what Lord Justice Leveson said is a very, very modest proposal where the only statutory intervention is only at, as Martin said, at a second level. There's no content regulation at all. I mean, the idea that somehow
Ofcom regulates content?
An Ofcom, and his proposal is not regulating content.
Yes, but the whole raison d'etre of Ofcom is to regulate content.
The whole purpose of Ofcom in his proposal is just as Lara said. In Ireland, a similar system has the minister doing the vetting of the regulator. He's doing it at one remove, so he's having an independent body which is saying whether the regulator is
vetting again.
Damien's trying to get in. Damien,
I was just going to
just answer David Cameron's question about Ofcom, which is how do you get around the fact that the Secretary of State is the person who appoints Ofcom?
Well, to be fair to the Leveson report and to Leveson, he suggests that his preference is that Ofcom take the role of auditing the new regulatory body, but he even says this does not necessarily have to be Ofcom. It could be an independent commissioner that serves this purpose and acts completely independently even of Ofcom if we want to spend even more money and duplicate roles even more than we do at the moment. But I think we need to clarify, if we talk about mission creep or slippery slope, etc., and I think these are potential issues that we should take very seriously. But if you look at the proposals, there is no institution being established by this piece of proposed legislation that would lead to any potential slippery slope. There is no mechanism of mission creep. We've got very hung up on whether there would be a new law or not. Would this constitute statutory? And would this necessarily then constitute censorship? I think we need to be very clear, Neil, about what the law does. We're talking about...
I think press freedom is something...
Journalists, as you know well, are regulated by laws. Defamation, privacy. What we're talking about is changing those laws by which they're already regulated in order to incentivize people to enter the self-regulatory system.
Okay, let me bring in Charlie here. I mean, Charlie, in America, if they were watching this, and they could be, I suppose, they'd be utterly mystified and horrified by this conversation. And they would say, what you want politicians involved in the conversation about what is acceptable in the media.
Oh, Krishnan, really?
Sorry, this is...
Let me bring Charlie into this first, and then Martin, I'll come back to you.
I mean, Lara Kilgan is quite rightly the expert on international comparisons, but the important thing to remember about these is there are different ways of doing things, and you pay your money, and you get what you want. And if you, the American system is completely different, where you have your First Amendment protection, and pretty much you still have libel laws and so on, but pretty much it's then free and open. Now, in contrast, somewhere like Germany or France, much more restrictive legislation, much more statutory involvement, and you want to take a choice. Personally, I do not want a continental-style media, which is much more in the pockets of politicians. I quite like the abrasive, antagonistic relationship that you've got in Britain, but you won't get that. The closer you bring the journalists to government or the politicians through regulation, I think you will change that culture.
Lara was saying it works very well in Ireland, and you were shaking your head.
Partly because I think to compare, it's bad enough comparing Germany with Britain. Very different cultures all round, completely different political systems. Ireland is a very small country with a very small press, and I'm afraid it hasn't got hugely high standards of probity in public life with politicians either. So I'm not really sure that you can just transfer that model over.
Martin.
So can we actually come back, I think, to what Lord Justice Leveson said, because we're drifting quite a long way away, and specifically about what he said about this law, because he said three things. We focused only on one of them. He said three things that this law would do.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave. Earlier. My deepest apologies, because I've been enjoying this, I have to say. I think it's
thank you for joining us, Neil.
I'm afraid I have another engagement. Many apologies, and nice to have met you all, even you, Hugh.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Neil. Martin, go ahead.
The first one, which is relevant to the point about the US, is that he specifically says that the law would, for the first time, put a legal duty on the government to protect the freedom of the press. That is almost, it's a phenomenally similar wording to the First Amendment. It would be the first time there was anything comparable to the First Amendment. The third thing he says is that there should be special protection for people who are in this system. Information and privacy, something that many members of the press have been asking for specifically. So of the three things he suggested, I think I'd be very surprised if almost any newspapers said they were against them. I mean, it would be bizarre if they did. So the only thing we're talking about here is the second one. Now, the second one, in terms of verifying the independence, we're also getting extremely hung up on this issue of Ofcom. Now, he suggested Ofcom, but he recognized that it might not have to be Ofcom. Let's for a second, as Damien said, imagine it was some other independent body. Would that cause, we've lost Neil now, but would that cause quite as much angst amongst everyone as Ofcom is?
Okay, well let's put the Ofcom question aside for a second. Hugh, I just want to ask you another question about how this would work in practice. Suppose I'm a member of the public, I suddenly find myself at the centre of a news story, and I've got 20 photographers at the bottom of my garden, except they're freelancers and they're supplying pictures to Italian, Spanish and Australian tabloid magazines. Is there anything I could do under this new system of regulation to get them to go away, or to stop them banging on my door, or to get them to behave according to the British Code of Conduct?
Well, I think you're rather moving away from the important points. I mean, the way you deal with photographers...
Does that mean the answer is no?
No. Well, wait a minute. The way you deal with photographers is you want to make sure that people don't buy their photographs. Now, the present position is that the PCC issues desist notices, which sort of vaguely work, because although some of them are selling photographs to French and Italian magazines, basically it's the British who are usually for British celebs who are the main source of income. Now, presumably a new body would carry on with that kind of system. I don't think. I mean, a better question, if you don't mind me saying, is a question actually. About. Well. Let me put your better question. Is what happens? What happens is if a newspaper runs an article saying of you that you've been taking backhanders to misreport news stories. Now, at the moment, you can make a complaint to the PCC, and if the newspaper says we've got a confidential source, the PCC will probably throw out your complaint. Otherwise, you can go to the courts and vast sums of money are spent. What this proposal is suggesting is that there be a third way, which at no expense to you can go through an arbitral system and you can get an effective remedy. Now that is something which is, in terms of individuals having problems with the press, is a fantastic bonus. So and what's more from the press point of view, it's the idea is, I mean, he says specifically that this should be conducted on an inquisitorial basis. In other words, without massive legal fees. So the idea is you can bring your complaint, you can get a quick remedy, and it doesn't cost the press, it doesn't cost either you or the press hundreds of thousands of pounds to fight. Puts lawyers out of business, but is actually very helpful to both the press and the public.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. So, I mean, does it... yeah, Lara, you wanted to come in on this. I mean, what does it mean for sort of the libel system and where lawyers fit in?
Well, sorry, I just wanted to just go back to that question you asked about people being camped down at the bottom of your garden. Leveson has made clear that those desist notices were successful and they should continue as part of the work of the new body. He's also made clear that any photographers who would be providing material for a member of this press council would be covered. So this isn't just a tick box membership. It means that in order to benefit from those, not having the punitive damages or fines imposed on you, you have to be very actively compliant. Again, that's how it works in Ireland, and that means that anybody who's providing information for you must also be behaving in an ethical way. So it weaves in a kind of framework of ethical accountability that would extend to potentially those photographers supplying the mainstream press.
Who else wants to come in on this whole question of redress that Hugh raised?
Can I mention, I mean, there has been a certain amount of criticism of Leveson around the idea that somehow he has ignored the internet. Because there's a parallel question, which is if those photographs were not for an Italian newspaper but were for an online-only news provider, would there be any form of redress? And I think one of the interesting and quite attractive ideas in the report is that, in a sense, because what you're doing is establishing incentives, so effectively protection from liability, you incentivize people, including online providers, to enter into this scheme. So far from ignoring online providers, those incentives to join the scheme and benefit from shelter from very high damages awards, for example, would apply to you. So you could see a Huffington Post, for example, saying, actually, we will have that. This is actually something which benefits us. We're an ethical provider of news. We will join it. And that's something, presumably, which the newspapers might be rather pleased about.
And do you think individuals could join that as well? If you've got a particularly popular blog, you know, suppose you're a high-profile commentator who starts their own website, and you're basically a one-man operation. Or,
I guess it would come down to the tariffs and the costs.
But I think that's
pay to join.
I think that's contemplated.
Martin?
Yeah.
What do you think about the sort of the scope of this to encompass the internet, or will we all be back here in 5 years' time trying to work out a new regulatory framework?
Well, the point that he's made, which I think, as Damien says, people have sort of missed, is that actually he hasn't talked about the internet. Partly, I mean, one can see that in one sense as being anachronistic, but in another sense, you could say actually, well, he's been pretty forward-looking because he's been pretty converged. Actually, he hasn't talked about the internet. What he has talked about, what he talked about at some length in one of the bigger volumes, is about how to distinguish between power and influence. And that was what he was worried about. He was saying, you know, how do you have a system where if you have a significant amount of power and influence, he doesn't just talk about audience, he talks about, you know, financial resources and legal might, etc. If you are a very, very big organization, in other words, and you can do significant harm, then surely that, you know, an individual member of the public who has significantly less power, there needs to be some way to balance that disparity, and regulation is the obvious way to do that.
Lara?
Just to echo that, and this is something obviously Martin will be able to say much more about, but one of the proposals on the table from the Media Standards Trust was for a requirement for all of the larger providers or publications to join a mandatory system. So it'd be mandatory over a certain size threshold. And it's a proposal that's on the table in Australia at the moment across platforms. Hasn't been yay or nayed by the government, but it's on the table, and it would catch all those sort of news limited, large cross-platform publishers in Australia if it goes through. He hasn't done that. He hasn't set any sort of size threshold, which I think is extremely flexible and leaves it open for smaller providers, even right down to an individual blogger or sort of one-man band to join. And by not setting a threshold, those positive the positive benefits that you can get out of the system are then open to everybody. What he has said is you shouldn't duplicate regulation. So anybody covered by Ofcom, that's broadcasting, and anybody covered by APVOD, that's video on demand material, they couldn't join because clearly that would duplicate. But he's left it open for anybody else to be able to join, and he's been very platform neutral as far as I can see.
This is very interesting then, Charlie. So do you think he has? It is effectively future-proofed this debate, or will we all be back here?
I think in a way, some people have mocked Leveson, as you say, for the fact there are only 5 paragraphs in there on the internet. But I agree with the colleagues actually that in a way I'm delighted that he hasn't tried to sort of park his bus in cyberspace as well. I think he's realised that the drivers of most news online are still going to be the same newspapers with some bloggers and so on. And as we move, I can see the flexibility for that regulatory system. What I don't quite understand, though, again, is why that has to have some kind of statutory underpinning. Even the protection talked about there about public interest, I don't see why that has to have such a direct statutory underpinning. So I agree. I think the internet is going to change the nature of this debate over time, but actually this could be quite a useful vehicle, partly because my one hope is that, and I think this will happen to a degree, whether we get independent or statutory regulation, is that I think if newspapers got any sense, they'll realise that they need to take some of these standards on board so they can show the public that they're not like all that other filth and rubbish that you get on the internet, that they're a brand that you can trust.
That'll be the public who bought all the newspapers.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. We've done half an hour, and I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
See you.